So, one day, Sally, Charlie Brown, and Snoopy were sitting around a table. And Sally was posing a question. And Charlie Brown was contemplating the question. And Snoopy, as we all know, with his little thought bubble above him, was answering the question. So this is what Sally asked. What are the words you hate most to hear? And Snoopy replied, you stay home now and be a good dog. Now in the Peanuts comic strip, Snoopy is the mystic. Snoopy is the one that has the wisdom and has gained the understanding over the ages. And this is really interesting because when you look at Ernest Holmes' writing, the one Ernest Holmes who founded our movement, along with other New Thought people, Ernest Holmes was very much looking towards the mystic. And Holmes holds this up to all of us. He talks about the great mystics. He talks about Jesus and Buddha and Muhammad and those kinds of people. And we could add people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa and other people. And the thing is that Holmes doesn't believe that everyone is a mystic. And I know some people in our movement, sometimes in classes and stuff, we like to kind of get into that kumbaya moment of we're all mystics. What Holmes says is we're not all mystics. We all have the capability of becoming mystics. And so Holmes sort of holds this up as the great ideal. Things like the Christ consciousness and the Buddha nature. And in Buddhism, they talk about the idea of enlightenment and awareness and awakeness. You know, that famous story where someone asked Buddha if he was a god, and Buddha said, no, I'm awake. And so Holmes holds up this idea of being the mystic as something for us to aspire to. Recently, I don't know how many of you saw that Oprah interviewed Jack Kornfield, and Judy and I watched it. In fact, we watched it, I believe, on Christmas Eve. It was a great thing to watch. And when Oprah asked Jack Kornfield what the definition of the Dharma is, now my understanding of the Dharma was that the Dharma is a teaching. It's another word for teaching. And what Jack Kornfield said I found really interesting because he acknowledged the fact that the definition of Dharma is teaching, but he also said it is a journey that we take. And the Dharma is a journey in teaching, a journey in realization that we commit ourselves to. And I thought about this, and I thought about the idea of what Snoopy had to say, because basically Snoopy is saying, hey, the thing that I don't want to hear most is I have to stay someplace. In other words, what Snoopy is saying is, hey, I want to get out there. I want to have my journey. I want to walk the Dharmic path. Now in Buddhism, nowadays we're used to all of the icons of Buddhism, the statue of the Buddha and the different incarnations of what the Buddha looks like in this way. But for hundreds of years before we got the statues, which were actually influenced very much by the Roman architecture and artistic sensibility, the Buddhists didn't want to be outdone by the Romans, so they had to come up with their own ideas. But before that, the lotus blossom or the lotus flower was the icon of Buddhism, and it still is. And so the reason for this is because the lotus blossom or the lotus flower represents that journey to enlightenment. Or as Ernest Holmes would say, that journey to becoming a mystic. So this is what's really interesting. The reason that the lotus flower is so important to Buddhism, and you know, it's so important that there were parts of Asia where the lotus flower was not indigenous, and yet people in those parts of Asia still grabbed a hold of the idea of the lotus flower. It was so powerful. And the reason it was so powerful is because the lotus flower represents this plant that is down at the bottom of sometimes a stagnant, murky, muddy kind of water. And it's down there in its roots. And there's something within the lotus flower that wants to reach up through that water into the sunshine to where it opens up into one of the most gorgeous flowers in the world. And it feels the warmth of the sun. And it seeks out the light. Thus it seeks out enlightenment. And so the lotus flower is a representation of enlightenment. That part of us that literally opens up to the sun, the light, and the warmth of illumination. But the reason that Buddhism loves the idea of the lotus flower is because of its beginnings. Because, like Snoopy, the lotus flower does not want to stay down there. It doesn't want to stay on the bottom. It wants to take the journey. And I think about what it must be like for the lotus flower in some level of consciousness or thought to be willing to take that journey. Yeah, the payoff is great, to be a mystic, to be enlightened, to be aware, to be awake, to be open to all of the wonders and magic of the universe, all of the wonders and magic of God. But imagine the journey that has to be taken first, and where the lotus flower comes from. I went and saw a movie this week, and I saw the movie Nebraska. And it's a pretty depressing movie, actually. But it has some redemption at the end of it that reminded me of the journey of the lotus flower. So Bruce Dern, who is this great old character actor, and we probably all know him from years of playing all kinds of crazy characters in westerns and all kinds of anti-hero movies. Bruce Dern is an elderly gentleman now. He's older. And he just has this great patinaed, well-worn face. He just has this perfect face for the role. And he plays a character that sitting in a theater watching him, you become so frustrated with him. He is so stubborn and obstinate, and he's so non-communicative. And he is obviously, right from the very beginning, you get the fact that he is a heavy alcoholic. And he has caused his family all kinds of problems, and he's in the movie is about he is in the process of causing them even greater problems. And so Bruce Dern, this character, is obsessed with going from Billings, Montana, where he lives, to Nebraska, the big city in Nebraska. Lincoln, Nebraska, that's right. Okay. This is crowd participation. Okay. It has nothing to do with my memory, it's crowd participation. Okay. So he wants to go to Lincoln, Nebraska, and he thinks that he's won $1 million. And everybody in his life knows he hasn't won $1 million. He's got some piece of paper he got in the mail from some magazine company that they want him to subscribe to stuff. And he is convinced he's won $1 million. And they are he's just driving his family crazy, because what he does is, he's not a great communicator. He has this idea. And so because he doesn't drive anymore, he'll go out and he'll start walking the interstate towards Lincoln, Nebraska. And so the police pick him up and they take him in and they call his family and they have to come get him. And he's got 2 sons, and his mom is his wife and their mom is just beside herself. It's like, oh my God, your father is driving me crazy, and I think that we just need to put him in some sort of institution. And he's old and he's a drunk and he's an alcoholic and he doesn't talk and he doesn't listen. He's got these crazy ideas. And so the 2 sons are trying to figure this out, and they have to go out and get him off the road, and they have to get him from the police and all this kind of stuff. And the 2 brothers who are adults are talking, and one of the brothers says, I'm beginning to think that Mom is right. I think that we need to put Dad away because, he obviously has gone off the deep end, and we can't deal with him. But the other son is engaged. And the other son, while he finds his dad incredibly frustrating, he still wants to engage. And he's trying to talk to this man who just knows nothing about communication and tends to live in his own world and tends to somehow be shut down to any kind of reason. And yet he's so hard-headed. He's so ingrained in his way of living. And so he actually contemplates taking his father on this journey. And his brother goes, "You've got to be kidding. Since when do you care about what he does? Because he never cared about us growing up. Do you remember what it was like growing up with him? He never cared about us." But the one son, his brother, struggles with it, and he says, "Why, I think I may take him on this journey." And see, what his brother doesn't understand about him is that he's come to a place in his own life of starting to look at some things. Unbeknownst to the family, who really knows very much about this, he had kind of a long-term live-in relationship that has just ended. His girlfriend has moved out, and he sits in his apartment and he really doesn't kind of understand why. He starts to recognize that maybe he's drinking a little bit too much. And he's also recognizing that his houseplants are all dying on him. He doesn't know what to do with them. And see, when we talk about, in metaphysics, the law of attraction, the law of attraction is not just about getting stuff. The law of attraction is about manifesting opportunities. The lotus flower manifests the journey. His father gives him the opportunity to take a journey. Why does he want to take the journey with his father? Because he is beginning to question some things about his life. Question what is going on with himself. Question who and what he is. And he realizes that at some level he has to try and understand this person in order to understand that. So they begin to take the journey. And he begins to ask his father questions. And, I'll give you an example of the Bruce Dern character, how he responds. And so this one night, they're sitting in a bar on the trip, and, Dad is drinking alcohol, and the younger, his son, is trying to drink Mountain Dew. He's trying not to drink, His father's upset with him because he's not drinking, and so, he gets into that conversation because his father wants him to join him in this pathology, and the son is trying to be there and be present without actually getting involved in it. So a good example of this Bruce Dern character was the son. He said, "Dad," he says, when you and Mom got together, did you talk about what it was to be in a relationship? Did you talk about the things you wanted to do together? For example, did you talk about having children?" And the Bruce Dern character goes, "No. You guys just kind of showed up." He said, well, how can that happen? How can you have children and not really talk about it? And he goes, "Well," he says, "I like to have sex, and your mom's a Catholic. Do the math." He said, it was bound to happen, so the two of you showed up. And so this young man, this young adult, is trying to glean something out of his dad about what are you all about, and what is life all about, and what can you share with me? What can you give me that I can gain in terms of my experience? And so along the way, they come into a small town in Nebraska called Hawthorne, which is where his dad and mom had grown up. A little tiny, sad, kind of used to be farming town, and they come in, it's got a couple of bars in it, and that's it, and there's some family there. And during the course of the time that they spend in Hawthorne, which they end up being there for several days, his son begins to learn about his father's journey really from other people. The fact that the reason his father is such an alcoholic now is because he's always had a drinking problem. The fact that he came from a situation where as a young person he was abused by his parents. The fact that he was laying in bed next to his little brother the night he died of scarlet fever. The fact that he went to Korea And when he came back, people noticed he was different. And the fact that in this town, there wasn't really any way to deal with anything except that everybody drank. So he begins to put the pieces together. He begins to gain some form and some way of understanding what life is all about. You see, when confronted with the idea of taking the journey, he took the journey. He took the journey up through the muck and the mire and the smelly water that the lotus blossom comes up through. And ultimately what you find out in this is that he discovers that deep down inside this old man, this thing that is so buried that you can hardly find it, is his own aspirations to be somebody. His own aspirations to have a level of pride. And so in a tiny gesture, and I'm not going to give this away for those of you who will see the movie, in a tiny gesture at the very end of the film, he hands his dad away a small way of being proud of himself, of being able to show up back in this town with something to show for himself. So ultimately, what is the journey all about? The journey is about gaining some form of understanding, and the journey is about being able to reflect that back into forgiveness and love and attention. We don't heal anything through abandonment. We don't heal anything through turning away from it. We heal it by giving our attention. We heal by engaging. And what the young man understood was that, sure, by putting dad in an institution, it would be some way to contain him. It would be some way to keep him home, be a good dog, and stay at home. But in order to really understand, we have to take the journey. That's what Snoopy is trying to tell us. That in order to gain wisdom, in order to become the mystic, we have to be willing to take the journey. I'm in a situation right now where my oldest son has been away, physically away from me, long distances away for quite a while now. He's 30, what is he going to be? 37. Yeah, 37, 38. And he left California in his very early 20s. And he moved to Seattle, lived in Seattle, he went to Chicago, he lived in New Orleans. He lived in Seattle off and on a few times. And so over the years we've kind of developed, the long distance relationships, the texting, the phone calls, the things like that. And every once in a while we'd see each other, and these, when we would see each other, they were very kind of artificial and staged. And hey, how you doing? And we sit down and we'd have the lunch and we'd have the dinner and we'd spend a day together, and we would, he would take me around and show me where he worked and all that kind of stuff. And so recently in this last year, he moved back to Northern California. And first of all, he went to Santa Cruz, and now he moved to Oakland just recently, so I feel like he's creeping back, Now mixed in with all this is that about 7 or 8 years ago, I changed careers. And my kids don't know what to do with me as a minister. And, the term minister and reverend are so weird, They don't know what to do with that, And so I think they're afraid that I'm going to try and save them or something, and I keep telling them, that's not my brand of religion, and they know that. But they're trying to find their way around this. They grew up with me being one thing, and then I become something else, and so they're trying to navigate those waters. So my son coming back to be relatively close, and the fact that some years ago I changed, we're both trying to navigate these waters. So he called me, and he was up in this area visiting his mother and his grandparents. And so the day after Christmas, he wanted to have dinner with me before he went back to the Bay Area with his girlfriend. She had to work the next day. And so the day after Christmas, I was here all day, and then I get in my car and I drive to Chico, and I'm driving down there, and I want to be really present, and I really want to show up in this new way. Because a while back he said, "Hey, I can see more of you." I said, "Oh, good." What does that look like? What's that feel like? You mean I got to be present? So, I'm not dealing with a little kid anymore. I'm dealing with, a middle-aged man. It's weird for me to say I have a middle-aged son. And because I'm still middle-aged, but, I wish. But anyway, so I have a middle-aged son, and so, and I've changed careers, and things have changed, and so it's like, okay, yeah, this has been more time together, So I went down there, and it was really interesting because my son has two grandfathers, and they are both in the process of packing their bags to move on. Okay? And one of his grandfathers, who lives in this area, when he was a little kid, he was very close to him. There's a lot of pictures of him sitting on Grandpa's lap and stuff. They had a real connection. And my dad, who lives in Arizona, my dad is the last connection he has with my mom, who is very close to him. My dad wasn't real close to him, but my mom was. And so he grew up, the two grandparents he really connected to was my mom and his mother's dad. Okay? And these are the two grandfathers that are in the process of packing their bags and leaving. So, it is the nature of who I am and the nature of what I am that I like having real conversations. I love the exploration of life. I love the journey. And so superficial conversations sometimes, I know they have their place, and I know that they're important, and so sometimes I kind of walk on eggshells, I think like a lot of us do, when we want to have that real journey, So we're sitting there and having dinner, and he's got a girlfriend who I don't know really well. She's pretty new. I've met her a couple of times. I'm kind of getting to know both of them, Feel like I'm kind of auditioning, And so I asked him, I said, I know you've spent time with your grandfather, and I know he's got a lot of stuff going on. How was that? And my son was like, wow, it's really hard because he's very angry, he's very depressed, he's very withdrawn. It's hard for me to see him like this, and he's physically he's pretty wiped out and pretty confined, And so he said to me, he goes, he says, I don't know if this is right or not, but there's a part of me that would like to, I almost think it might be better if he moved on. And I said, well, of course. I said, that's the journey. I said, it's just simply a journey to the next level of existence. I said, leaving this world is just as natural as being here. And so his girlfriend, she surprised me. She chimed in and she asked me what I think about ghosts, And so we started talking about ghosts. But see, the idea of the ghost thing opened us up to having a conversation about the soul. And it was beautiful because it was all so natural how this conversation was. It wasn't like, I brought a whiteboard with me with Sharpies, Okay, this is the soul, this is the Trinity, and, all that kind of stuff. It was just very natural, this conversation. Why were we having the conversation? Because my son has entered into a journey with his grandfather, which is not very pleasant for him. And so I know that at that moment, sitting in a restaurant, he invited me into the journey. And it's our willingness to have the frickin' journey. It's our willingness to have the conversation. It's our willingness to talk about life. That's how we become the mystic. That's how we become enlightened, is to be willing to travel up that muddy water to the surface. And so then he asked me, because I got a phone call the other day about my own father, and he's not very close to my dad. But my own father is, again, it looks like he's beginning to pack his bags to move on. Some things have come up. So he asked me, he says, how's Grandpa, my dad? So I told him, I said, sometime in the spring I may be going down there because, it's gone this particular direction and it looks like he may be moving on. And so he asked me, he says, how is he doing this? How is he going about this? And I recognized here's a young man who's in his 30s who's turning to me and say, how do we do this, Dad? How do we do this? And so we had a conversation about the different experiences I've had, especially since I've become a minister, of being with people who are in this particular part of the journey. And so we had this conversation, and we began to talk about the two grandfathers and how they're going through it and what's going on with them. And what I recognized was, in this conversation, he was, how do you think we do this, and what does this mean? And it was amazing to me. But we couldn't get there without having the conversation about the grandfathers and what's going on there. To be willing to show up for that. Like Snoopy says, get out of the house and go out there. Go out there and take the journey. Go out there and take the journey. There is no religious or spiritual idea worth any amount of salt at all that tells us not to have the tough conversations. That tells us not to show up in that muddy water. Because that is the path to enlightenment. Jack Kornfield says we spend time in a philosophy and we distill it down to where it is livable and it is meaningful. And we find out what our true meaning is. We are not here in this world to just collect stuff. We are here to gain wisdom. We are here to evolve. We are here to move upward and onward. And the only way we can do that is to open up and have the conversations. I found a quote from that great mystic Anonymous. And this is what it says. For the enlightened, or for the mystic, self-discovery is their real mother and father. Self-discovery is what makes life living, worth living. It brings the life into life. Ernest Holmes, if you read his material, when he talks about the mystic, he says, the mystic knows, K-N-O-W-S, sometimes capitalized, the mystic knows. Ernest Holmes, what's your definition of the mystic? The one who knows. Knows what? Knows what it's all about. Knows the journey. Knows what it is to truly be present. And I'm an optimistic person. I teach an optimistic philosophy. One of the things that I think that where we are right now in society and in our culture, one of the things that I know that we will find our way through this. I know we will find our way, but there seems to be right now some kind of a disconnect. It's becoming really easy to abandon. It's become really easy to, that's a little bit rough. There's some human stuff going on there, so I will just go into, another place. I will go into the electronics. I will go into Facebook. I will go into, spiritual.com because there's no people there. There's no muddy water there. Now I know we will overcome this. That's the optimist in me. But what I know is that abandoning doesn't fix anything. It doesn't heal anything. What I know is that we have to show up for it. And we have to gain that wisdom. We have to work to turn our face to the sun of illumination. When Oprah was talking to Jack Kornfield, he really emphasized the fact of Buddha was awake. Buddha was awake. Buddha did not deny. Buddha was awake. Snoopy is awake. He doesn't want to be left home. He wants to experience. In the reading I shared with you this morning, Ernest Holmes said the greatest adventure we can take in terms of our thinking and our consciousness, the greatest adventure we can make. The greatest trip. The greatest place we can enter into. One of the things I love about this teaching is that when we come to a place to where there is something to create or transcend or transform or to heal, that we come back to that place of knowing the truth of ourselves. That no matter what stage we are in terms of that muddy water, we know that we are the lotus flower. Well, sometimes we don't. We don't know that we're the lotus flower. And when that's the case, we have a prayer ministry here with practitioners who we can sit down and we can know that. Who can enter into that place of prayer and know that truth for us. And to know that no matter where we are in terms of that muddy water, that the sun is just above. The sun is always there, and we are who we always have been. And the person to do that for you today is Sheila McDonald.